Hello and welcome back to Ranger in Time, Disaster on the Titanic, a book by Kate Mesner. In this video, we will go through comprehension questions for the section titled Author's Note. Author's Note comprehension questions. Number 1. Why do you think men were willing to work at the Harland and Wolff shipyard building the Titanic between 1909 and 1911? When working conditions were so dangerous? Sample answer. I believe men were willing to work at the Harland and Wolff shipyard building the Titanic, even though there was a risk of injury or even death, because jobs were likely scarce at that time in Ireland. These men needed to provide for their families. Question 2. Passengers aboard Titanic's maiden voyage came from many different countries. What were 7 of these countries? Sample answer. Passengers aboard Titanic's maiden voyage came from countries such as England, France, Ireland, Germany, Sweden, Norway, and Lebanon. Question number 3. What does the author tell us about the 3 main characters in this book? Patrick, Hamad, and Miriam. Sample answer. The author tells us that the main characters, Patrick, Hamad, and Miriam, are made up or fictional. She goes on to tell us that she based them on real crew members and passengers on board the Titanic during its maiden voyage. Question 4. What special connection did Thomas Andrews, a real character in this book, have to Titanic? Sample answer. Thomas Andrews was the man who designed Titanic. Question 5. The author, Kate Mesner, tells us that she based the story on historical documents. What are historical documents? Sample answer. Historical documents are first-hand evidence about an historical event or person. Historical documents are also known as primary documents. Examples of historical documents are handwritten letters, newspaper articles, court cases, legislative documents, and photographs. Question 6. Why might some passengers who survived the sinking of Titanic possibly have felt guilty about surviving? Sample answer. Some passengers who survived the Titanic's sinking might have felt guilty about surviving because they were in lifeboats that were not filled to capacity. The survivors may have felt guilty about not pulling passengers from the water until their lifeboats were filled to save these passengers from dying of hypothermia or drowning. Some survivors might not have felt guilty about leaving passengers in the frigid water because they knew helping desperate passengers out of the freezing water could have led to lifeboats capsizing and everyone dying. Question 7. Do you think getting women and children into the lifeboats first was a good idea? Explain your answer. Sample answer. I think getting women and children into the lifeboats first was a good idea. I base this opinion on the fact that children had their whole lives in front of them, so adults were simply sacrificing less years of living. In addition, at that time, women often raised children, so getting the women into the lifeboats before men was, in my mind, the practical thing to do. Question 8. If you had been a third-class passenger on board the Titanic during its maiden voyage, why might you have been upset about how the lifeboats were being loaded after the ship struck an iceberg and was clearly sinking? Sample answer. If I had been a third-class passenger on board the Titanic during its maiden voyage, I would have been upset about how the lifeboats were being loaded after the ship struck an iceberg and was clearly sinking, because first and second-class passengers were taking precious seats in the lifeboats first. As a third-class passenger, I might not get a seat. In addition, it would have been clear to me that the lifeboats were not loaded to capacity. This meant third-class passengers were needlessly being left to die from hypothermia or drowning. Question 9. Who was Thomas Miller, and why do you think his oldest son chose to not spend the 2 pennies Thomas gave him in 1912? Sample answer. Thomas Miller was a real person. He was an assistant deck engineer on the Titanic in 1912. Before he left on Titanic's maiden voyage, he gave his 2 sons, who were staying with an aunt after the death of their mother, 2 pennies. Thomas asked his sons to not spend the pennies until they were able to join him in America, where he planned to start a new life for himself and his sons. I think the oldest son never spent the 2 pennies his father gave him to honor his father's memory. Thomas Miller was among those who died when Titanic sank. And this wraps up the comprehension questions for the author's notes section of the book Ranger in Time, Disaster on the Titanic, a book by Kate Mesner.